Chapter 3. In his dream that night, books rained down on Henry. First paperbacks, then the heavy hardbacks. Soon the books were everywhere, completely covering the floor. He started running. The books thudded onto the floor behind him. He tried to squeeze his way through the gaps between the books, and he ended up stuck in between two massive leather-bound history books. New books kept appearing from above, as if it were a game of Tetris, and he was one of the building blocks at the bottom that was about to disappear. He woke up in a cold sweat. It took him a moment to realize that he was in his own bedroom. Fearfully, he eyed the bookshelf. He had to sleep somewhere where there were no books. In the living room. Pulling his blanket with him, Henry went next door and lay down on the couch. The lights of Edinburgh flashed in through the large picture window. The old, yellow streetlights radiated a soft light. The orange glow of the few remaining sodium lamps made the city's night a bit warmer. There are no stars so lovely as Edinburgh street lamps, people said. But when he saw all the lights and illuminated windows, all Henry could think about was all the readers he hadn't reached. Drowsily, he reached for the copy of Proust on the coffee table. Perhaps reading a few pages from it would cheer him up. He wanted to find that one quote Natalie had read out the other day, the lines about memory returning all at once. He leafed and leafed, but could not find it. Strange, he had been quite sure that it was on the first few pages, Henry was thinking. Right before that passage was the meditation on tasting the Madeleine. He flipped to it and skimmed it, right here. Strange. Why did a dry description of Combray's streets and houses come right after the passage about the Madeleine? Proust didn't usually make such hard cuts. Henry closed the book and turned it over in his hands. Had he bought a defective copy? But he had owned the book for a long time and had read it before. And hadn't the passage been there the other day in the cafe? Was he going crazy? He hadn't been himself since his novel had been published, maybe not even before that. Or was it a conspiracy? Perhaps the literary world had finally joined forces against him, wanted to wear him down with such games. A moment later, he put his hand to his forehead. His thoughts were starting to spiral out of control again. He was probably just tired. Tomorrow, first thing in the morning, he would go to the big bookstore and look for a new copy of Swan's Way. He stood at the window and looked at the full moon. It was like a sad spot on someone's retina. Natalie had played cat and mouse with a company for several weeks now. Whenever the interview was due, she cancelled, mostly the day before. The nearer it came, the more she began to feel that sinking feeling, as if she was being swallowed up by a sinkhole, until it turned into vertigo and became unbearable. Her favourite excuse was sudden illness, of course, followed by family tragedy, which she couldn't use that often, which was closely followed by problems with her laptop, an excuse she once managed to produce shortly before the interview. Sometimes the companies were relentless. They would track her down by phone, seemingly begging for her to arrange a new interview date. She would then manage to schedule one for the following week, glad that she had a whole weekend to decide what to do about the date. Her boyfriend, Zane, told her that she had an ambivalent relationship with companies. She retorted that he had one with the police. Ever since she had known him, he had been spraying provocative graffiti all over the city, adding one little crime to his record every year. At the same time, he claimed that no one really understood that it was the general public that provoked police violence. At one point, he even applied to the police as a graphic designer, saying that he wanted to help them improve their image. To say that Natalie didn't really understand her boyfriend sometimes would be an understatement. Then again, Zane was several years older than her, so maybe she was still too young. Older people seem to get wrapped up in all sorts of contradictions. Natalie was born right on the cusp between millennials and Gen Z, although she didn't know what the Z stood for. Would it be the generation to end all generations, the last one before the big nuclear or AI war? After graduating from design school, she had had high hopes for herself and the world, had started applying to every job she could find. After all, she had thought, she was the perfect mix of creative and tech-savvy. Her brain was overactive, generating virtual solutions to potential problems within seconds. She was not someone who would rest comfortably on her professional laurels. A while back, her job was listed as one of the most promising future professions in a leading tech magazine. She was going to be at the forefront of the evolution of how humans and computers interact. But then, everything turned out differently. At some point towards the end of her long application journey, Natalie came across a design that looked kind of familiar. She was not too surprised, since everyone was using templates these days. She had used them herself at uni for one or two designs when she hadn't been entirely sure about the user flow and deadlines had been tight. "All modern art is just pastiche anyway," Zane had said, "so stealing doesn't really matter." Only at second glance it hit her like a fist blow. This was her own design. She was frantically scrolling through the website, sitting on one of the hard benches in front of the university library, where she used to sit to write applications and work on designs well after her graduation. The green outline, the detailed icons, these were all her ideas. Now she remembered, at the start of her job search, when she had still felt hopeful and motivated, she had somehow managed to get through to the second interview stage. They had then given her a take-home assignment to redesign a few screens of their app. She remembered sitting in the exact same spot, brainstorming ideas and drawing low-fidelity frames on her tablet. She had then added colour, developing them into prototypes, shifting things around. She liked to think of it as making a dress. First, you cut the elements into prototype pieces, adding a little here and pinning something there. Then you could try it out on a model. She had spent a whole weekend working on that design, a weekend she would otherwise have spent drinking with Zane in the park or going to a concert. In the end, she made sure that all the designs were clean, that the margins were consistent, and that all pixels were rounded. She had double-checked that everything was in line with the company's style guide. Then she had sent it off to the company, being almost 100% sure that this would ensure her the position. She had practically redesigned their whole website, polished their image. There had been silence for a few days. Natalie hadn't been able to apply for another position. All her energy had been sapped, all the colours and shapes sucked out of her. Then, one tired, sun-drenched Friday, she found an email from HR in her inbox. The dry subject line let her freeze inside. It was a rejection, a standard one that they send out to anyone. They had opted for a different candidate, it said, but they'd keep her in the talent pool. In desperation, she had tried to phone HR, but no one had picked up. They were probably already enjoying some drinks under parasols. Sunny days weren't a dime a dozen in Edinburgh. When the sun would eventually come out, everyone would rush out as fast as possible. And so, she had to wait a full weekend until she would find out more. A full weekend that she had planned anything for, because she had hoped for a positive callback that would have allowed her to slide through it in silent bliss. First thing Monday morning, she had called HR again to ask for the reasons for her rejection. The HR person had sounded sleepy. When she gave her the reasons, it was like she was reading them from a piece of paper or a computer screen. Her design had been good, the HR person said, but another applicant's design had simply struck the tone of the company better. As for the specific reasons, they were banned by data protection laws from revealing those. After the incident with the stolen design, she gradually lost interest in the job search. Even junior positions seemed to require applicants to have worked as a designer for a year at a startup. Some had 4 or even 5 interview rounds, while she was often knocked out in the first round. The companies that offered remotely interesting opportunities were inundated with applicants anyway. Most of the companies, however, were the same B2B nonsense, selling something that wasn't quite tangible. some kind of solutions or systems that Natalie couldn't wrap her head around. Natalie began to suspect that the advertised positions didn't even exist, that they were just a way for the companies or job boards to generate engagement. Soon, it began to slip away from her what her work was actually about. Sure, she wrote about it in her cover letters, but the art of what she was doing itself gradually faded into memory. Had someone asked her on the street what made a good website, she wouldn't have known what to say. Meanwhile, her boyfriend became a regular star with the press, a local Banksy. All he had to do was to go out and spray a motif somewhere, and lo and behold, there was an article about him in the local section the next day. People loved his stuff. It reminded them of the 80s in a non-cynical, almost nostalgic way, without being superficial. Natalie was happy for him, but at the same time, envy ate at her from the inside. Envy that Zane didn't even seem to put that much effort into his art, yet people were still eating out of his hand. Meanwhile, it cost Natalie every last effort to get up in the morning, sit at the computer, and send out job applications. She sometimes thought that Zane's artwork looked mass-produced, and she had told him as much on more than one occasion. Sometimes it escalated into a fight, and once Natalie had thrown a fork at him. Afterwards they had made passionate, angry love. Zane liked her temper. And it wasn't as if he didn't have his own problems. At this point he was jobless, or as he put it, job-free. He lived on a small artist's grant, which he claimed he had come by through fraud. In fact, he would have had to be an artist in residence at a particular place to receive his grant, but he had never gone to that place, receiving the grant anyway, by mistake of the Art Association. He said that he liked it here, that he had everything he needed here: the lake, the trees, the empty sky between the building and the clouds. The old brick-wall factory buildings, perfect to spray on, a vintage chic background that some artists could only dream of. He didn't like the big cities like London, where everything was already covered in paint, so that there was only some place left for tags.
On a Friday, Natalie met her Aunt Diane at the Camera Obscura. Usually she would have gone there with her boyfriend, but he was mostly spending time with his artist friends these days. In fact, he latched onto them like a sea creature that had been rescued from the obscure depths of the deep sea. Natalie had practically been raised by her aunt, as her mum was often away on tour. Diane owned a pharmacy and wrote spiritual self-help books in her spare time. Ever since Natalie could remember, her house had been full of herb bundles and more than enough incense to hang a fire in it. Natalie was an atheist, and her aunt was a firm believer in the supernatural. They both found each other's faith to be very amusing. Natalie knew that her aunt had never once seen any sign of a ghost in her life, and her business sense seemed to remain absolutely untouched by any spiritual musings. Together, Natalie and Diane walked towards the castle-like building, which was topped by a quirky-looking, onion-shaped black-and-white tower.
"So, I've nearly finished this book about witchcraft,"
her aunt said.
"I'm telling you, the market is hungry for something like this, especially women, of course. Empowering yourself by making use of the centuries-old matriarchal teachings."
Her aunt was a short, brown-haired woman with a prominent nose. She was wearing a jumper with a flower pattern and trousers, as well as an orange scarf, and had the barest hint of a smile on her lips. She looked exactly like her mother, only a tiny bit older, at least to Natalie's eyes. Diane turned to her.
"And how are you? How's the job hunt going?"
The way her aunt phrased this made it actually sound like a fun thing.
"It's miserable."
Natalie pulled her cardigan closer.
"The companies don't want me. And there I was, thinking that going into IT would surely provide me with a stable job. I actually think I'm suffering from application burnout.
They had entered the building and were now standing in front of a large gift shop whose outside was shimmering with every colour imaginable. Large rainbow-shaped wreaths hung from the ceiling, and the walls were adorned with amorphous butterflies. It was the kind of thing Natalie would have loved to design.
Now that seems a bit exaggerated. At least you don't have to stand around in a pharmacy for 12 hours a day because there's not enough staff.
Natalie's aunt lived in a small town outside of Edinburgh, and the more the years went on, the more difficult it became to find personnel. Natalie knew that her aunt would always hire her if she asked, but she didn't really feel like going back to the small town she grew up in. They entered the first exhibition room, which housed a few gigantic mirrors. When Natalie and her aunt stood next to each other in front of one of them, their bodies were magically swapped. So Natalie suddenly found herself wearing grey trousers and holding a black purse in her right hand. She chuckled.
Sometimes I can't help but feel that you young people get frustrated too quickly. Why don't you try to apply for internships? That might be the easiest way to get a foot in the door.
Her aunt tugged at her jumper, causing the black shirt worn by her reflection to move.
Believe me, I've tried. But apparently, so did all of Edinburgh.
The next mirrors were painted entirely black, and their polka-dotted edges glowed as Natalie walked past. In the next room, each mirror appeared to be filled with different cats when you looked at it at a certain angle, while the floor was a mosaic of various different coloured patterns. These were the kinds of things that Natalie was really into. She loved being able to think about herself in a completely different way every now and then, which was probably why she had already changed careers at her young age. After finishing school, she had started out as a tattoo artist, but had found herself increasingly dissatisfied with the mundane, repetitive nature of it. Most people had always asked for the same motives, never for her elaborate sketches the tattoo studio's owners had allowed her to include in their portfolio.
After that, she had studied art for a bit at the Edinburgh College of Art. It had left her with £7,000 less and the feeling that she had learned about marketing rather than art. The professors had always told them to find their niche, something unique to them that would make them stand out. At some point, all the students in her class had churned out fairly similar artwork on a regular basis. Even the things they said had started to sound alike, as was often the case in such discourses which happened in an academic context. An echo chamber of words that still resonated in Natalie's dreams. At some point, she had dropped out and pursued web design.
I don't believe that. Maybe you have to try harder. Something will come up.
Her aunt said.
The universe will come forward when you least expect it.
The fact that her aunt still resorted to such platitudes, despite having written numerous spiritual guidebooks herself, made Natalie feel a little angry. Besides, she had just contradicted herself. In the past, Natalie wouldn't have even noticed something like that. But lately, her perception of the world had become painfully sharp.
You don't know what it's like. You don't know how many positions I've applied to. Even freelance stuff.
Natalie had signed up to all the evil freelancing platforms that took a big bite out of the freelancer's project income.
It's not like it was when you were young. I'm competing with people from all over the world. I just feel so replaceable right now.
Natalie had never put it so clearly before, not even to herself in her own mind. But that was exactly how she felt. There really came a new clarity along with her dejection. Somehow it felt good to sink to the bottom of that feeling, to stop struggling in mid-air.
Whenever Natalie met with Henry,
She felt that the world was actually quite simple. Like most older people, he seemed unaware of how complicated life was for people her age, how little room there seemed to be for the individual to, in a way, spread out. At least, that was her feeling. Of course, Henry had probably already achieved everything he wanted to achieve when it was still possible, when there was more space. And now he could sit in his recliner, rest and look down on everything, savor all his masculine confidence. But she didn't even mind that much, at least for now. There was the cozy cafe and the table where they sat down, the stories she read and the opinions that they voiced. And then there was the rest of the world, which seemed to be an odd combination of the familiar and the incomprehensible.